Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and on behalf of everyone at P&P and the staff here at 6 and I, thanks to all of you for participating this evening, whether you've come in person or are watching virtually from home. By the way, both P&P and 6 and I are celebrating anniversaries this year. For P&P, it's our 40th, and for 6 and I, it's the 20th. We're very excited to have George Stephanopoulos with us to talk about his new book, The Situation Room, the inside story of presidents in crisis. George, of course, is a major presence at ABC News, where he's been for 2.5 decades. He hosts the network's Sunday morning news program and co-anchors Good Morning America. In a previous career in politics and government, George served in the Clinton administration as a senior presidential advisor and later wrote a best-selling book about that experience, All Too Human. George's new book is about one of the most vital areas of the White House many of us hear about from time to time, especially when there's a national security crisis, but few of us ever get to see it. Well, George takes us inside the Situation Room, recounts its origin under President Kennedy, and highlights key episodes over the past 60 years in describing how presidents and their teams have used the Situation Room to monitor critical events and make pivotal decisions. George is a very skilled interviewer and a practiced storyteller, so it's no surprise that his book is a very lively read filled with informative details that reveal much about the differing management styles of presidents. There's also some never-before-told stuff in the book, which we'll hear about in a minute, I'm sure. Again, no surprise given George's instinctive feel for news. Up here with George this evening to moderate will be one of Washington's most experienced political reporters, Jonathan Martin. Jonathan has covered politics for the New York Times, National Review magazine, and the national journals The Hotline. And currently, he's senior political columnist at Politico. He also co-wrote the best-selling book, This Will Not Pass, about the 2020 election and the early months of Joe Biden's presidency. Please join me in welcoming George Stephanopoulos and Jonathan Martin.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Bradley, for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's a real treat and an honor for me to talk to George about his fantastic new book. I'm a print guy, and us print guys should look at the TV swells and sometimes say, those guys don't do kind of the nitty-gritty reporting and hard work. I can just tell you, as a print guy, I was incredibly impressed with this book. There is so much detail and so much reporting in here. You guys need to buy this book immediately. It's fantastic, and we're going to get into it tonight, detail by detail. But first, I want to talk to George about what's in the news right now, because we're in Washington, and of course, all the chatter is about the president and the former president agreeing to at least 2 different debates. What did it tell you yesterday morning waking up to see Joe Biden not only agreeing to debates, but saying, let's hold the first one in June?
I was surprised at the whole thing. I was actually at the White House last week talking to the veterans of the Situation Room and doing some interviews in the Situation Room before the book came out, and I talked to some other White House officials, and we were talking about the possibility of a debate. And one of the things I said is, just as an observer, I could understand this year, given what happened in 2020, foregoing debates, just not having them at all. I mean, the Chris Wallace debate back in 2020, where apparently President Trump had COVID during the debate, was the worst presidential debate ever.
And that would have been the easy cover, right? To say what happened last time was a total debacle. Yeah.
So, but I think that Biden, knows that it's a close race right now. He's probably behind. Had to do something to shake it up. Right. And I think it was a pretty smart move. They gained the leverage by calling for the debates and doing it on their terms. I do think that the rules that Biden asked for, and apparently Trump has agreed to, no audience, mic cuts off when your time is up, are essential. There's no way you can have a debate without those rules, I think, right now. Because you've interviewed him as a print guy. I've interviewed former President Trump probably 50, 60 times. It's in a live setting. Like, I won't do a live interview with him anymore.
Right.
Because so much of it is false. You simply can't keep up with it.
Are they going to have the capacity to cut off the mics, do you think?
Well, it's TV. It's not an audience. So, yes. I mean, when my mic goes off on GMA, you can't hear me. I mean, so, yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens. I mean, it will still be interesting to see. I'm pretty sure the first debate is going to happen.
Yeah.
I hope the second debate happens.
Exactly.
That's the ABC
Exactly.
debate in September, but I'm not positive.
Less confident.
That it will.
Well, we're going to keep the mic on here tonight, that's for sure. There are so many scenes in this book that I think could be made into a movie. It's like a collection of incredibly cinematic moments. There's high and there's low. From Omarosa to Henry Kissinger. Think about that for a second. You talk to both of them. You talk to seemingly everybody. The drama is extraordinary. 2 assassinations. The response.
Well, one attempt, an assassination and assassination.
One would be, exactly. And you have those on tape, audio tapes of both of those. 9/11, January 6th, Osama Bin Laden, and a drunk Dick Nixon. It's an extraordinary array. But I want to start, though, where everything started in this book, which is how and why and who were behind creating the namesake of the book.
It all began with JFK, John F. Kennedy, and it happened after the Bay of Pigs, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, an absolute disaster. And Kennedy was pretty pissed off after that. He went in public and took full responsibility, but he was very angry at the CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff for, he felt, giving him bad information. So what he wanted was an information flow of intelligence and public information that would come directly to the White House so that he and his team could assess it for themselves. And immediately after the Bay of Pigs, he ordered the creation of the Situation Room. They built it in 2 weeks at a cost of about $30,000. But what's interesting, one of the other interesting twists about this is that he actually received a memo calling for the creation of the Situation Room 2 weeks before the Bay of Pigs by one of the most fascinating characters we came across in the book. Have you ever heard of a man named Godfrey McHugh? He was John F. Kennedy's military aide. He was an Air Force general who spoke English with a French accent. He actually grew up in Paris, the son of an American industrialist, and he was one of these larger-than-life figures that served in the Kennedy White House. As a teenager, he actually dined at the White House with Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. He sailed on Harry Truman's yacht. He dated Jackie Kennedy before John Kennedy married her. Seriously, yes. And so he was a very close personal aide to John F. Kennedy, and we believe, and I should give a shout out now to my co-writer Lisa Dickey and my researchers Cameron Peters and Emily Michelle, because we did an enormous amount of research trying to find out what the first mention of the Situation Room was. We can't be 1,000% sure, but we're pretty sure that the first time that term was ever used was in this memo that Godfrey McHugh forwarded to John F. Kennedy 2 weeks before the Bay of Pigs, and then he implemented it after the Bay of Pigs. And then after the Bay of Pigs, ironically, Kennedy didn't really use the Situation Room that much. He didn't like it. He called it a pig pen at one point. McGeorge Bundy, who was his national security advisor, scolded him, saying, "You've got to go down there for your briefings." But he didn't really go down there that much afterwards.
And there's not a lot of audio, and this is something I want to come back to, but there's not a lot of audio, but there is extraordinary audio from the day in Dallas when JFK is shot. Tell us about that and the exchange between...
It's from the Situation Room. It's audio from the Situation Room to a plane that was carrying Pierre Salinger, who was John F. Kennedy's press secretary, and several other cabinet officials. They were on their way to Tokyo on November 22nd. And we put the transcripts in the book, and you can hear them in the audio book, and that's what's most affecting. And you're hearing a series of 3 phone calls from the Situation Room to Pierre Salinger. On the one hand, they're very bureaucratic. Pierre Salinger here actually they're using Wayside. That was his handle. Yeah. And they're relaying the information. The president has been shot. 5 minutes later, the president's been shot, and Connolly's been shot, and it's serious. And then the final phone call that comes in, they turn the plane around, the president has died. But simply, you think that you know everything about that day, but hearing the tapes in real time from November 22nd is really affecting, because so many people who worked with John F. Kennedy were so close to him. He had a small family around him.
And Cronkite's voice can be heard on the background of the tapes. It's extraordinary. I mentioned the level of detail. And one of the things that jumped out to me as somebody who's long been fascinated by LBJ, LBJ liked the room so much that he moved an aqua blue chair downstairs to have a good comfy chair in the room, which is so LBJ, right?
Had he served 8 years, he would have spent more time in the Situation Room than any other president. My guess is that President Biden is going to beat him because he had 8 years as vice president. He's already had 4 years as president. We'll see what happens in November, and he spends an extraordinary amount of time there as well. But for time in office, no one spent more time in the Situation Room or dealt with the Situation Room, we think, more than LBJ. And of course, that was mostly because of Vietnam. He was obsessed trying to gather any possible detail he could about what was going on in Vietnam. And again, we include transcripts of these phone calls that he was making all through the night to the Situation Room, and you can hear them in the audiobook as well, desperate for any kind of information, granular detail about what was going on in Vietnam, small battles, the names of a couple of casualties. At one point he was calling so much that the Situation Room director had to admonish one of the sit-room duty officers who, when Johnson called him, said, "It's a quiet night," and the sit-room director says, when the president calls, it's probably best not to say nothing is going on. Always have something that you can tell him at some point.
And the opposite of LBJ was Nixon, who never more or less went down.
More or less. He never used it at all. And there's two very different reasons for it. One a little more high-minded than the other. The high-minded one, and I talked to Henry Kissinger about this, he said that he believed that Lyndon Johnson succumbed to what he called the Situation Room syndrome, which is the idea that you can control the world from that windowless room in the White House basements. On the one hand, you have to try, but on the other hand, it is important to remember that you can't. But the other reason, and maybe this was more telling in Nixon's case, was that he didn't trust those who were working in the Situation.
Deep state.
The deep state in its day. Remember, Kissinger and Nixon famously tapped the phones of some of their national security aides. So he rarely, if ever, went down there. And what I write about it in the book is a night where, probably the most extraordinary in the Situation Room, when the president wasn't there. It was during the first Yom Kippur War in October 1973. And this set the scene. October 1973, Nixon's presidency is crumbling. Vice President Agnew is resigning. The tapes have come out. The articles of impeachment are being written up. He has the Saturday Night Massacre. And at the same time that he's going through with the Saturday Night Massacre, the Yom Kippur War breaks out, and the Soviets start to move ships towards the Middle East. Kissinger was actually in New York when it first happened. He raced down to Washington, and they ended up having a long, several-hour meeting in the Situation Room where they were trying to figure out what to do. And my favorite word in the entire book, it comes in a memorandum about that meeting from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Thomas Moorer, who said, "We had a piss swisher of a meeting in the White House Situation Room."
It was military jargon.
We found out that it was a military jargon, although several military people said they had never heard it before either. I guess it means it was a pretty exciting meeting. And what happened there was that because the Soviets were moving their ships towards the Middle East, Kissinger and his team, without any participation by Nixon at all. Nixon is up, not in the Oval Office. Nixon is up in the old executive office building, his hideaway office, drinking Ballantine scotch, listening to Victory at Sea, probably passed out by the time Kissinger made the decision to raise the nuclear threat level to DEFCON III, which is 2 steps away from all-out war. It had only been there one other time before during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he just did it on his own authority. Nixon didn't know anything about it. It turned out to have worked, so thank goodness for that. But one of the other things that came out many years later, and this is to me one of the most fascinating details in the book, so you have Nixon completely out of commission while we go on nuclear alert. And many years later, the Soviet files were released as well, and it turns out that Leonid Brezhnev was in his dacha outside of Moscow, passed out because of vodka and sleeping pills. So you had this huge game of superpower chicken, and neither leader was in charge.
A drunken Cold War clash. There's a quote here that jumped off the page to me on page 62. You quote a former NSC staffer who said during this period, quote, Al Haig was the president of the United States. This is an NSC staffer saying that on the record. That's an extraordinary thing, and I want you to keep that in mind because we're going to come back to Al Haig. But George, talk for a minute now about technology, because we're now in 73, and the communication between the Soviets and the Americans, between Washington and Moscow, is rudimentary. It's a teletype machine,
Well, it's
right?
a teletype. The hotline is not some red phone on the president's desk. It's a teletype machine that's not even in the Oval Office. And they have the same thing they had the same thing in the Soviet Union. Another teletype machine. The communications were quite slow at the time. Nothing that we can even really imagine today.
Ford is a fascinating figure in a lot of ways, and he's also a unique figure in the American presidency because he was such a down-to-earth, decent man. And you have an anecdote in there that really reveals that. And it's about a name who's actually been in the news recently, who many of you will recognize, David Hume Kennerly. Who's the storied photographer, whose pictures I think a lot of you know, who also was the Ford White House staff photographer.
27 years old.
Moment. He's 27 years old, much more liberal than anybody else, I'm sure, in the Ford White House. And so tell us about that moment where Kennerly suddenly appears in the room and speaks.
It's just incredible. And he's the White House photographer. He's been a journalist up until 6 months before. He's a kid. And this is during the Mayaguez crisis. Remember the Mayaguez crisis? There were American Marines who were being held hostage on a Cambodian merchant ship, and they had to figure out what to do about it.
Only in D.C., by the way.
But people nod their heads, yes.
Of course,
and say
Mayaguez.
Yes. You know the Mayaguez.
Like the Teapot Dome, of course, right? Yeah, obviously, right.
And they were going back and forth about how to retaliate, whether to retaliate. And Ford was surrounded by a lot of hardliners at the time. And they're having this meeting, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, David Hume Kennerly, the White House photographer, pipes up and says, have you guys considered that there may not really be a Cambodian government in charge, that they may not have the kind of control that you think they have? He was actually basically arguing to go slow. And I have to say, when I first heard about this story, we ended up then interviewing David about it, I was flabbergasted. I mean, all my time, both working in the White House and covering White Houses, I couldn't imagine the White House photographer speaking up in a meeting. They're supposed to sit back very silently and just click, 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 piping up without even, asking or being asked
and Ford
for their
takes it in
opinion.
stride.
But Ford did not admonish him in the moment. It turned out that Kennerly ended up swaying the meeting. I mean, it went in his direction. Ford did tell him afterwards, the next time you have something to say, just tell me privately. Don't say it
Send me a note.
in front of me.
Send me a note.
But it was really incredible.
Yeah. I think one of the most agonizing parts of the book to read was the Carter section, because so much of it, of course, is about the failed hostage rescue, Desert One. And I think you really bring that alive. And again, it's one of those moments where you read it and there's this sense of foreboding because that we're coming back to that exact same question. Are we going to send helicopters into this daring mission a few decades later? This first time around, it's a failure. It doesn't work. What happens?
Well, this is in 1980. The hostages had been in Iran for about 6 months, and in late April 1980, Carter ordered a rescue mission. The helicopters went down in the desert. It was famously failed. Cy Vance resigned, although he had told Carter beforehand he was against the mission, and he resigned ahead of time. and it was, it crippled the Carter presidency. In the book, one of the new things we reveal is, because people have written about the Iran hostage crisis before, and we were trying to figure out what could we bring new that was related to the Situation Room particularly. And I came across one line in Jimmy Carter's diary from May 8th, 1980, and it said, had a meeting on parapsychology in the Situation Room, and it's something about remote viewers, longitude, latitude, etc. And to me, for our book's purposes, seeing parapsychology and Situation Room in the same sentence, I was intrigued. I wanted to find out what was going on there, and our team worked on it for many, many months because we couldn't find anything written about it at all. We went to the Carter Library. There was nothing written about it. No one had any memories of the meeting except there was one possible lead, a naval aide in the Carter White House named Jake Stewart. He's probably about 85 years old now. I think he lives in Georgia. We sent him emails. We sent him letters. I had phone calls. He was quite reluctant to speak. But after a lot of back and forth, he finally agreed to a Zoom. And you'll appreciate this as a reporter. You have those moments when you get a nugget that no one else has. And for us, it happened. Yeah. It happened when we got him on the Zoom, and he gets up, and he's still a sprightly guy. And I said, this Carter diary entry, May 8th, 1980, can you tell us about that? And here was a guy who had been acting like he didn't want to talk to us at all for a long time. He just kind of sits back, and a big smile comes up on his face, and he says, "You found out about that, huh?" And he proceeded for the next hour to tell us an incredible story. Yeah. It turned out that Jake Stewart, and again, this is 2 weeks after the failed rescue mission. So Carter is in absolute crisis. He is desperate. And he calls for this meeting with Jake Stewart on parapsychology. Turns out that Jake Stewart had become the White House expert on something called Operation Grill Flame. Now, again, this is DC, so they'll probably nod their heads and say, yeah, we know all about Grill Flame, too. Well, Operation Grill Flame was a program in the CIA and the DIA in the late 1970s and early 1980s where they actually used psychics. They called them remote viewers, people who would sit in a dark room at Fort Meade and other places and imagine what was happening in remote parts of I'm not kidding. This is a real program. Millions of dollars invested in it. Now, to be fair to those who were, advocates of Operation Grill Flame, they would say that they had that the intelligence that they received had a 30 to 40% success rate. It's actually not that bad for intelligence. They have the meeting. Stewart tells the president, and interestingly, because this is something that was also rare in the White House. In fact, we couldn't find any other instances of a first lady participating in a meeting in the Situation Room. Lady Bird Johnson once went down with scrambled eggs. Well, we couldn't find anybody who participated in a meeting in the Situation Room. And with the meeting, it was just Zbigniew Brzezinski, as far as we can tell, Jake Stewart, the president, and Rosalind Carter, getting this briefing on whether this parapsychology psychics program was working. Now, it turned out the reason that Rosalind Carter was there is that she was really, really interested in the supernatural. Wow. She had befriended, remember Uri Geller, the guy who used to bend spoons with his mind? She had had a several-hour meeting with him. She set up a meeting with him and the president. They were intrigued by the idea of the paranormal and psychics, and so they have this entire briefing. Jake Stewart goes on for about 45 minutes. Carter doesn't say a word, and then at the end of the 45 minutes, he just takes out his notepad, writes one word on it, slides it across the table in the Situation Room. You can guess what the word was. Hostages. And he slid it across the table and said, "Can you do anything?" And, that just shows how desperate Carter was in that moment. It turned out that Jake believes that they helped locate a hostage named Richard Queen, who was suffering from multiple sclerosis, who was taken out several months later, but of course the rest of the hostages weren't released until Ronald Reagan took the oath of office.
There's a picture
several
of
months
Carter
later.
in the book sprawled out on a White House couch.
In the final 36 hours of his presidency.
Exhausted, trying to get the hostages home, sleeping in the office. It's extraordinary. And by the way, who would have thought that both the Reagan White House and Carter White House would have had a weakness for astrology and supernatural? But it turns out there was some continuity after all between Carter and Reagan. Who knew? But this is a good moment, though, to sort of leave the chronology for a second, because you mentioned tracking down that key source in Georgia. Obviously there's a lot of books written by a lot of presidents and their staffers over the years about sort of inside the room moments. What distinguishes this book after reading it, I can tell you immediately, is you got a hold of a lot of career people, not political appointees, but career people who worked in the sit room as duty officers. And they talked for the first time, I think, in their lives to a journalist.
To us, this was the gift
Yeah.
of doing the book. We did over 100 interviews for the book, and we tracked down the White House Situation Room duty officers have some kind of an alumni group, and we first got in touch with a couple of them, and then once one or two started talking, the rest, a lot of them, came on board, and this was, for me, was the best part of doing this book. For those of you who don't know, the people who the men and women who work in the White House Situation Room every day are there 24/7. They work. When Kennedy set it up, the original people would work 24-hour shifts and then take 2 days off. Now they work 12-hour shifts. They're drawn from all over the government, the CIA, the DIA, Homeland Security, State Defense, all branches of the military, and are drawn in for 1 to 3 year terms to operate this watch center, which monitors the world for the White House, takes all the information coming in, synthesizes it for the president and his top staff, or the alert system for the White House, and then they also help the information flow back out from the White House. And these people are so impressive. They have such a rigorous ethic of being apolitical. They say we serve the presidency, we don't serve the president. They take that incredibly seriously. They maintain the highest competence in character every single day. And I have to say, Jonathan and I were talking about how exhausting it can be to cover politics these days. Exhausting emotionally, physically, mentally, in every single way. And my executive producer at GMA will tell you that often when I get there at 3:30 or 4 in the morning, I start the day quite irritated and a little angry, and often very, very sad because of what our politics has descended to. And then every afternoon, Lisa, Cameron, Emily, and I would get on a Zoom with these duty officers and come away feeling better and inspired every single time. They are incredible people. And, for me, one of the huge takeaways, we've heard a lot about the deep state these last several years, and one of my big takeaways from working on this book is the deep state is absolutely packed with patriots, and they are the people the men and women who work in the White House Situation Room.
Hear, hear. One of those moments, I know a lot of folks in this room will never forget where they were, March of 1981, just a couple of miles north of here, when John Hinckley shot President Reagan. And it's an incredible chapter in the book, the Reagan chapter is, in no small part because of what happens an hour after the shooting in the White House in the sit room.
Richard Allen, the president's national security advisor, after they found out the president's been shot, convenes a meeting in the White House Situation Room and takes a small portable tape recorder into the Situation Room. That had never happened before. Tape recorders are not allowed in the White House Situation Room. The only other time that we found...
Yeah, most of the time.
Yes.
Most of the time.
The only other time we found someone was able to get one in was, remember Omarosa, who worked for...
I teased you guys about that, exactly.
She somehow got probably in a pen, a tape recorder into the Situation Room to record John Kelly firing her in the White House Situation Room, which had never happened before either, a firing. But in Reagan's time,
We'll come back to the Trump era.
Alan
Exactly.
meant to be taping
Save your appetites, yeah.
this meeting, and you have the president's top advisors deliberating what they're going to do in the wake of this shooting, and it just gives you real insight into the way government actually works or doesn't work at various moments. It captures the confusion. They don't have great information on the president's condition or the condition of James Brady. They're getting some reports that maybe the Russians are trying to take advantage of this by moving closer to our shores, and they have to figure out how to respond. And one of the things you see in the transcript is Weinberger, who's the defense secretary at the time, fighting with Al Haig, who's the Secretary of State, who says, "You didn't tell me you were going to move." And he said, "Well, I didn't have time. You were up in the briefing room at the time. I had to do this in real time." One of the other things it captures is, we all now remember, you're talking about Al Haig, who was basically acting president for several weeks during the Nixon administration. He became Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan, and for those of you who remember that day, it was probably the most infamous moment of Al Haig's career, because in the middle of all these deliberations, Vice President Bush is away. He's trying to make his way back
Dallas,
from Dallas. In the middle of all this, Al Haig goes up to the White House briefing room and says that I'm in charge here. He believed that he was second in line for the presidency because he was Secretary of State. One of the things these transcripts reveal is that he actually said it in this meeting in the Situation Room, and everybody else around it thought it was so stupid that they didn't even bother to correct him. And so he goes up there and says it, and of course that ended up coloring his every moment of his career afterwards.
And you track down the transcripts of these tapes from that extraordinary day, but they're still classified.
Now, what had happened was the first tranche of the transcript, I think there's, correct me, is it 4 tapes or 5? Yeah. And the first 2, Richard Allen, actually 20 years ago, had published them in The Atlantic. But there are 2 other transcripts that had not been gone through at all, and it was kind of a little bit of detective work, and we couldn't do it perfectly, but trying to figure out who was saying what. But we couldn't listen to them. We had to work off the transcripts, but we were able to publish, we think, for the first time, parts of those other 2 transcripts which had not been published before.
And you can tell, even in the transcripts, not having the audio, who the voice is sometimes, because they're responding to a question.
Exactly.
And so you can sort of piece it together. That was fascinating. So there's some light moments here that I want to get to before we get to the heavier stuff, because there is heavier stuff, obviously, that all of us have lived through the last couple of decades. And that is these moments that you get a hold of, again, these details, where stuff I hadn't heard of before. One of them is John Major, who was the British Prime Minister, of course, before Tony Blair, who was a Tory, was close to Bush 41, had, very inappropriately helped Bush 41 try to get reelected in 92. Bill Clinton, of course, wins the election in 92, and the first conversation that Major and Clinton have is delayed. Tell us about that.
Well, one of the big jobs of the White House Situation Room, in fact, one of their biggest jobs, is to set up the phone calls for the presidents with foreign leaders. And it's an incredibly elaborate process that involves a lot of pre-calls and having some officers go up to the Oval Office and some stay down in the Situation Room, 3 people listening at the same time, because these calls by tradition are not recorded. You have 3 different people all taking notes and then putting it all together. And what happened with Major and Clinton, and one of the duty officers had the chance to tell us this story, is that's right. Major had allowed people to get into Bill Clinton's passport file during the 1992 campaign, because the Bush campaign was desperate for trying to dig up some dirt on whether or not, when he was a student at Oxford, he had gone to Russia and was somehow a communist. It didn't come to anything, but Clinton was pretty pissed off that Major allowed them to go into his passport files. So Major was, traditionally the call between the president and the prime minister is one of the first phone calls, if not the first, that the president has. But it was not getting set up, and finally the phone call was set up between John Major and Bill Clinton, and the duty officer told us the story, had everything set up, and world leaders often get into this game of, who's the more powerful, who's the alpha dog, of who's going to get on the phone first. Yeah. Generally, the president of the United States gets on after someone else gets on. Although with Putin, it becomes.
Yeah, I want to ask you about.
We'll talk about that in a minute. It becomes a whole different thing. But what happened when they finally set up the phone call? John Major gets on, and the minutes start to tick by. 5 minutes. 10 minutes, 20 minutes. Now, Clinton was famously late, but we're at 25 minutes, 30, 35.
Major's getting pissed now.
After 45 minutes, 45 minutes, Major finally gives up and says to the studio officer, "This is just ridiculous," and hangs up the phone. And as this is happening, the duty officer, who must have been in the Oval and could see the back driveway, Clinton was already on his way to play golf at the Army-Navy Club. There was no way he was ever going to take the phone call. I worked there. I was there then. I did not know this story, but I thought it impressed the duty officer.
And you mentioned Putin, and there's this great moment in the book where I guess one of the duty officers had developed a pretty good impression of Obama's voice, because Putin was famous for making presidents wait. And so they finally figured out a trick.
They finally figured out that they actually had a guy who would imitate Obama. And so that he would get on the phone with his Russian counterpart and say that, this is the president here, and then Putin would get on the line, and then Obama would come on afterwards.
It's amazing. The details of 9/11 are of course, engrossing. And I think it's the only time, tell me if I'm wrong, in the book where the action really does move physically from the Situation Room to a different part of the White House, right?
Well, that was one of the craziest days, and one of the reasons there had to be a complete overhaul of the White House Situation Room communications for a lot of reasons, but one of them was they had never anticipated. There's a separate, it's called the POC. It's the Emergency Operations Center for the President. That's the super secret bunker underneath the White House where the president basically and his family and a few top aides go when the nation is under tremendous threat. And on that morning, of course, President Bush was in Texas, but the vice president and Condi Rice and the first lady and several other aides were taken over to this POC, and there was bad communication between that and the president, because no one had ever anticipated it was supposed to be the president in the POC. He wouldn't have to call himself. But what was most moving to me, learning about that day, was learning about the valor of those who White House Situation Room duty officers on that day. Several of them weren't even on duty, and they raced toward the White House, including one naval officer we talk about, Ed Pedinsky, who was at a parent-teacher conference that morning, got word that the first plane had hit the tower and raced into the Situation Room. Several of his colleagues did exactly the same thing, racing into the Situation Room, even though people knew and believed that the White House was a target that day. Remember, after the first two planes went in, there were still other planes in the air, and many believed that the White House was the top target of al-Qaeda on that day. And for that reason, the White House was ordered to be evacuated, except for those who were in the super secret POC, the vice president and Condoleezza Rice. And the sit room director called down into the Situation Room first time and said, you guys have to evacuate. And they all kind of looked up and kept doing their jobs. Yeah. Called a second time, said, you have to evacuate. Didn't move. Called a third time, and finally I think it was Rob Hargis, who was one of the duty officers at the time, said, listen, we're just not going. Yeah. We're going to do our job today. And as Ed Pedinsky, a naval officer, said, this is where we fight from. This is what we are paid to do. This is our duty. So what had to happen in that moment is that they said, okay, and handed out a 3x5 card to every person in the room and said, write your name and social security number. That was the kill list. They were going to take it out, and they would at least know who was in the Situation Room if indeed the White House was attacked. But these people refused to leave. They stood their ground and served the president and the country all through, one of the worst crises in American history.
And there's the famous picture that you all have seen of when Andy Card, the chief of staff for President Bush, in that Florida classroom, whispers in the president's ear, "America is under attack." And it turns out that phrase
started in the Situation Room. That day, Rob Hargis was in charge of the Situation Room because Deb Lower, who is actually another military officer, was actually the sit room director, was with the president. Someone is always traveling with the president in Texas. And this may sound odd to you, but when the first plane hit the World Trade Center, they actually didn't freak out.
Yeah.
Because they said, because things like this do happen, not the World Trade Center, but planes hit buildings more often than you would think. So they weren't on the highest state of alert. But Rob Hargis was on the phone briefing Deb Lower in Texas when he saw on the screen a plane go into the tower. He thought at first it was a replay of the first plane going in, but then he saw across the bottom of the screen live on it, and it hit for him that this had just happened again. And he said immediately to Deb Lower, "America is under attack." She went to Andy Card and said, "America is under attack." Andy Card went to the president and said, "America is under attack," and that became one of the most memorable phrases from the day. But everybody who worked in the room and at the highest levels of the U.S. government at that time knew the second plane went in. They almost all of them knew it was an attack and knew it was Al-Qaeda.
And 10 years later, of course, the mastermind of 9/11, Osama Bin Laden, is tracked down in Pakistan. And it just so happens to have been about this time of year. It was sort of late spring. You were in D.C. because they had finally decided to go into Pakistan. And it was the weekend of the White House Correspondents' Dinner.
The day after, yep.
And you're at the ABC table, and you guys have seen this Correspondents' Dinner on C-SPAN, or maybe been to it over the years, sort of black tie Washington dinner, and you're sitting there with then Chief of Staff Bill Daley, the son and brother of Chicago mayors.
And Tom Donilon.
And they're looking at their phones furiously. And you have a great line here about what Daley says to you, his alibi.
Well, this was incredible. The White House Correspondents' Dinner is supposed to be a night off, more or less. And my wife was sitting next to Bill Daley, and he was paying her no attention at all. My wife's funny, and she's fun to sit next to at dinner. And he just wouldn't get off his phone. And she was ribbing him a little bit. Tom Donilon was popping up and down he's the National Security Advisor at the time, and he was definitely sweating that night, and they were really distracted. And you sort of thought something was going on, but it could have been anything. What was even funnier is that also at our table was Eric Stonestreet, one of the stars of Modern Family, and he was going on and on how he was so upset that his tour of the White House that was scheduled for the next day had been canceled. And Bill Daley mutters something about, "Oh, there's something wrong with the plumbing. We're trying to fix it all out." But it turned out that Bill Daley, Tom Donilon, the president, and probably the vice president were the only people in that room that night.
Leon. Yeah.
And Leon was there. Leon would have been there, of course, who knew exactly what was happening. Actually, this is a little thing that we didn't get the chance to include in the book, but the joke writers who were working with the president, which that was also the Correspondents' Dinner where he famously took on Donald Trump. Yeah. But they had written a couple of jokes about Osama bin Laden, and Obama just sort of went through the draft that afternoon and said, "That's not that funny. Well, let's just take it out." But they couldn't say a word. And of course, the next day it all unfolded. And again, one of the most moving things that, for me in retelling and learning more about that story was coming back full circle with this naval officer, Ed Padinsky, who had raced to the Situation Room on September 11th. And for a little more backstory on that, Padinsky had just come to the Situation Room from the Pentagon, and he had worked in the Pentagon Operations Center. And I think it was six of his colleagues, Navy guy. 6 of his fellow officers, including his best friend, were killed when the Pentagon was hit that day. He spent weeks going to funerals in the days after 9/11, but he stayed on watch. And then after the takedown of Osama Bin Laden, he was serving on an aircraft carrier. And it turned out this was the aircraft carrier where they brought Osama Bin Laden for burial at sea. He wasn't officially a pallbearer, but he was the intelligence officer so he knew what was going on, and he was able to tell us the story about what it felt like to have that kind of closure and to be able to witness that, knowing that his friends couldn't, but believing that at least there was finally some justice. And it was one of these things, and it's one of the things we came across often in the book, how so many of these officers and senior officials serve across administrations and end up having impact across decades.
He's racing to the White House on 9/11, D.C. cops waving him in because he flashes his badge, and then he's at sea when Bin Laden's body is brought to the ship that he is captaining. It's an extraordinary full circle story. But let's drill down a bit more into the sit room leading up to the decision to go after Bin Laden, because it was not a sure thing at all. In fact, it was a 30 to 40% assessment by the
original. I mean,
it was Bin Laden himself. Yeah.
Yeah, they had drawn a bead on this figure they called the pacer. They'd focused on this complex in Abbottabad. No one ever left. Very few people ever went in. Very high walls, quite elaborate for that suburb. But they were able to they had some communications with his couriers, but they were able to get some footage of a very tall man who would often walk on the roof, just pace around the roof. But they just couldn't be sure that it was Osama Bin Laden. They went and they were doing this was taking months and months and months, doing every intelligence assessment they possibly could. At the very final days, they even set up another red team, a separate team of intelligence officials to stress test what all the intelligence they had. And finally, Obama said, there were various estimates of the probability that it was Bin Laden, some as high as 80, most between 40 and 60. Obama finally just said, listen, this is a 50-50 call on whether or not it's Osama Bin Laden. And they have to make the judgment, the decision based on that kind of a probability. That's not that unusual, though. This is obviously the highest stress moment, but generally, those decisions that make it to the president in the Situation Room are never going to be slam dunk decisions. If they were easy decisions, they would have been, solved by somebody else. They're, 50-50, 60-40 at best.
And Obama does something different than every other president when he's making this incredibly consequential decision in that room.
He polled the room, and which you would imagine, and this is a pretty small room, it holds about 8 or 9 people at the main table for, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Vice President, CIA Director, the top officials, the principals on the National Security Council. But what Obama did after polling all of them for their opinion, he then went to the row that ringed everybody around the table, everybody's plus one, everybody's deputy who they brought into the meeting, and he asked for all of them for their opinions, as well as best we can determine. And I had never heard of a meeting where that happened before, but imagine if you're a relatively junior person having the President of the United States on the make or break decision of his presidency, asking you what you're going to do. One of the duty officers said, "Well, it's kind of easy for me because my boss had already had already declared himself, and I just was determined to be very short with whatever I said."
And just like Haig resurfaces back again under Reagan, Bob Gates makes a second appearance here, and it's the same issue. It's like the ghost of the past reemerging once again in the sit room, because Gates had worked under
he was in the CIA during
Stan
President
Turner,
Carter,
under Carter, for the hostage rescue that failed. And so Gates is reluctant on the Bin Laden.
Very reluctant. I mean, in fact, Gates was the only senior member of Obama's team who at first had argued against going in with the raid. He had argued for a drone strike, in part because he had been so scarred by the failed mission under President Carter and the helicopters going down. And he even told President Obama that, maybe I'm too colored by my experience. Maybe I'm too cautious because of my experience. But one of the things we were able to tease out in the book, and it was actually quite fun to do, and I think it's something very true to the experience of those who have worked in the Situation Room, is they really do learn from the past. I mean, you had generations of national security officials who went to school on what happened in the Iranian desert under President Carter. Admiral William McRaven, who led the mission, the SEAL mission that took out Osama Bin Laden, studied it in the greatest possible detail. They knew everything that went wrong. They knew that there were bad communications under Carter. They knew that there weren't enough helicopters. There weren't enough backup helicopters, and they had studied it so intensively that they were able to put that to fix this mission and make sure that they wouldn't make the same mistakes. And in fact, if you might remember that on the raid that took out Bin Laden, one of the helicopters did in fact go down. It had a hard landing. And I can just imagine, I think Ben Rhodes told us about this as well, said, at that moment, if you're working with President Obama, you think, oh my God, it is happening again. Yeah. And McRaven didn't even skip a beat. He was like that pilot who says, oh, we're going through a little turbulence right now. And because he had two other helicopters not 30 miles away that were all set up. And so even though there was a helicopter completely down in the compound, the other ones were already in the air to replace them. And it all happened like clockwork.
He had plan B.
And one of the things he said, they had done missions like this, and they still did all kinds of dress rehearsals and were completely prepared. But he said he had estimated that he had probably done 10 to 12,000 missions like this over his time with the Navy SEALs. This was just one more. It just happened to be the most important.
Let's tie a bow on the Bin Laden raid, though, with this extraordinary scene when Gates, who's the biggest skeptic of going into Abbottabad on this raid, comes back to the Pentagon and is confronted by some of his own advisors in the Pentagon.
Including Michelle Flournoy, who later served as Deputy Secretary of Defense. I went to graduate school with Michelle at Oxford in 1984. And then she served in the Clinton administration as well. But what she told me, and I had never heard this story before, she had never told me this story before. Gates had argued in the room against the raid and for the drone strike. And she and one of her colleagues who had been Gates's close advisors found out, and they went into his office and said, you can't stick by this decision. You must call the president back and say you back the mission. We've gone through every possible contingency on this plan, and we're convinced it is going to work. And you, as Secretary of Defense, can't be against it. What she then told me, as she was relaying this story to us, is that I actually had a little bit of influence over that moment. She reminded me of something I honestly did not remember, but it was a moment in the Clinton administration, 30 years earlier, 25 years earlier, where she was doing a Somalia after action report that was going to be quite tough on her superiors. And she came to me, she said she was afraid to deliver it because, she thought it was going to cost her job. And I did not remember, but she said, I told her at the time, listen, that really is our job. We're the political appointees. It is our job to give our bosses tough news when we believe they need to hear it. And I said something like, I get yelled at by the president every day. I'm still sitting here. It's okay. And she said that actually steeled her spine a little bit when she went into Gates on that day, which, made me feel great.
It was a really neat moment. We're coming to the end here. Let's talk about the Trump administration, which, as you write, was so dramatically different from any other president from JFK on. And a lot of this will ring familiar. We'll start with the lighter part of it. You mentioned the Omarosa pen tape, which almost sounds like Inspector Gadget. But also the poor duty officers having to put together printouts of chyrons.
Trump rarely, if ever, went to the Situation Room. He had a couple of stage photo ops down there, a few meetings, but didn't like it at all for reasons similar to Nixon. He didn't really trust the people inside the Situation Room. It wasn't his spot. He rarely, if ever, called down there. One of the few duties he required of them or asked them to do was he asked them to collect not tapes of what was happening on the news programs, but the banners that would go across the bottom of the screen, the chyrons, we call them. And they said it was like the strangest thing they'd ever been asked to do. But it was kind of difficult to write about President Trump because, one, so much has been written about him. We become so numb to how abnormal it was. But that was what struck me the most. If you look at the presidencies from Kennedy through Biden, there actually is a through line across the administrations about how the best White Houses work and the best national security decision-making processes work. And one of the things we all believe, as we were doing our interviews, is probably the model operation was Brent Scowcross operation under the first President Bush. I mean, John Bolton called them like the 1927 Yankees, and Democrats and Republicans alike pretty much agreed that he was the model. Jake Sullivan considers him a role model. And there was great continuity and conversation and communication across the administrations, regardless of party. Trump's is the outlier. There was just nothing normal about the way all of the operations, and Tom Bosser even said that, related about the way that his administration was dealing with these various crises, many of them created by the president himself, most notably, and we decided to open the book with this scene, most notably what was going on January 6th. We met a duty officer named Mike Stiegler, who it had been his dream to work in the White House. He's an intelligence officer, very soft-spoken guy, very dedicated guy, and he just did. This was the top of his bucket list to work in the White House. He ended up being assigned in the summer of 2020, which was not the best time to be assigned to the White House, and it wore on him a lot, particularly things like dealing with the aftermath of the George Floyd killing and all the protests outside the White House, and feeling like he was being targeted because of what was happening inside the White House at that time. All of the duty officers have to balance this serving the president and serving the presidency, but trying to balance those dueling loyalties became almost impossible on January 6th for Mike Stiegler. He knew from the moment he went to work that day that something ominous was happening in D.C. He was on duty when the line was breached at the Capitol. He was on the line with Secret Service and other officials on Capitol Hill who were trying to find the vice president and who were telling him that the vice president's life was in grave danger, and said that for him that was the most horrific moment of the day. They said, he said what he wanted people to understand is how close we came to losing the vice president. While that is happening inside the White House Situation Room, the President of the United States is upstairs sending out a tweet attacking Mike Pence. While they're implementing something called the continuity of government operations, and this was a series of executive orders that were first set up by Dwight Eisenhower that were designed to ensure that the government would function after a nuclear attack. Secret command centers, separate situation rooms, dealing with the line of succession. They were implementing that on January 6th. The only other time it had been done was on 9/11. And while they're implementing the continuity of government operations, the President of the United States is sitting up in a study off the Oval Office, sipping Diet Coke and watching television. I asked Mike Seeger, did the President call down to the Situation Room that day? Nope. Didn't call down once. Didn't call down to find out what was going on. Didn't call down to figure out how to stop the riot. We all know he didn't do anything that day. But for those who were working in the Situation Room, that was an absolutely crushing experience. a crisis inspired by the President of the United States. They've dealt with all kinds of crises.
Right.
They've dealt with assassinations, attempted assassinations. They've dealt with attacks. This time they were dealing with an insurrection inspired by the President, and he couldn't care less. And Mike Steger said he thought the institution would crumble that day. Didn't know how to talk about it for years, was very reluctant to talk to us, but finally did. And one of the things that gratified me is he actually, just the other day, texted me and said, thank you for allowing us to tell our story. And he said that he's heard from his other colleagues who now feel it was a cathartic moment for them as well, because no one understood the kind of pressure they were under on that day. I know we want to take some audience questions, but I just want to leave you this. The one way he did deal with it is that the last few January 6th, every January 6th, he and a few of his colleagues from the Situation Room go to the Lincoln Memorial, and they raise a glass to the fact that the Republic did stand that day and the institutions didn't crumble.
I do want to take some audience questions, but let's talk a bit about you, because this is something of a homecoming for you. You had not stepped into that room.
Since I left the White House on December 31st, 1996. I'd been to the White House many times since, as a reporter covering the administration, but I had not been back.
What was it like going back?
It was amazing, because when I worked in the Situation Room, I was in the pre-renovation era. It just wasn't that remarkable a place. It was just a tiny windowless room, kind of like a conference room in the Poconos, that you couldn't like sort of match it up with how consequential decisions being made there were. But I finally got to go back last August, just as we were finishing the manuscript, and as they were completing the renovation of the Situation Room. And my first thought as I walk in is, wow, it finally looks like the movies. It is unbelievable now. It's a series of different conference rooms, highest quality mahogany, highest tech screens everywhere. Each
and that leads to our first audience question, which is, I think this is why both the Bin Laden raid, and then also we should talk about President Biden for a minute too, why the collapse of Kabul was so incredibly powerful, because the technology has changed so much, and they can see
they see everything happen right now. Like when during the fall of Kabul, they were getting real-time information coming in through a general. In the days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they were having full-blown G8 summits, 8 world leaders, all on the screen, Hollywood Square style, having full summits during that crisis just a few weeks ago, when the night that Iran was retaliating for the Israeli retaliation of the strike. They were all in the Situation Room for about 12 hours watching in real time the drones go across. They wouldn't see the actual drones, but they were seeing dots of the drones going across and then being taken out. You can follow anything now from that room. And one of the cool things about it, though, is that there are screens everywhere. They're all hidden. But the minute someone without a security clearance walks in, they all go blank.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
It's a long way from James Baker getting a phone call from his son right before they were about to go fishing and being told, "Dad, put on CNN. Look at Tiananmen Square."
Well, actually, they were going to go play golf.
Oh, sorry,
yeah,
golf.
You're not golfing today, Dad. And people on CNN found out before Baker got in the call from his State Department Operations Center.
It's extraordinary. Biden, let's stay on Biden for a minute. He said he's very comfortable down there. He will probably be there as much, ultimately, as LBJ. Why is that, do you think? Why is Biden such a... is it because he was VP for 8 years?
Well, he first went there as a senator. I mean, he's been grown up. He was elected as a senator at 29.
Literally, as
literally,
folks, literally.
Now and 8 years as vice president, where he was really the devil's advocate inside the Situation Room for President Obama. 4 years as president, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Right. I mean, this is home turf for him.
So there's a question here that's kind of a fun one that I think a lot of folks in this audience have been wondering for a long time. Is it true that the character of Sam Seaborn on The West Wing was based on you?
Sort of. Not, and forgive me, but I'm blanking. What was the name of the deputy chief of staff?
Toby? Was it? Josh Lyman.
Josh.
Josh.
I'm actually.
Lyman.
Thank you.
West Wing fan right here. Here we go. Fully in D.C.
This is immodest, but I'll tell the story. When West Wing came on, I had left the White House. At first, they had asked me to come work on the show. I said no. I had other things I wanted to do. But I ended up doing a piece when it was first coming out for ABC News, and I went and got to go to a table read. And Aaron Sorkin introduced me, and he basically said, this is the original Slim Shady. And he said that what he was actually trying to do was have all the characters have a little bit.
Wow.
But it really is, I'm a mix of Josh and Sam. My job was a little bit more like Josh's job. And in fact, they did one thing that was, I haven't seen this episode in a gazillion years, but after I left the White House, I was sued by Judicial Watch. It was a completely made up lawsuit that was so made up, it got dismissed 5 or 6 times, but you know, they had unlimited money, so they kept appealing it. And I got so fed up that at the final deposition, it was with Larry Klayman, I just turned it into a fight. And I was debating with him the entire time, and they ended up doing an episode of The West Wing where I don't remember if it was Josh or
Based
Sam,
on that,
but he did exactly the same thing. It was fun to watch.
It was Josh.
It was Josh. There's the West.
It was Josh.
Well, you are a real West Wing aficionado.
I love it. I love it. So if Aaron Sorkin was to do a movie or a short series on this book, Aaron, if you're listening out there, you should. It'd be fantastic material. The stars, the protagonists, would be the duty officers.
Oh, no
in the
question
situation
about
room.
it. That, you know, for us, again, one of the things we always were trying to think of, because, you know, many of these incidents are well known, what can we bring that is new and different to it? And for us, it was giving voice to these duty officers who, as I said, are just incredible patriots who have served the country so well. Mike Stiegler said, this is the gentleman who served on January 6th. He was also serving on January 20th, Inauguration Day, for Joe Biden. And he was given the honor of writing the first intelligence brief from the Situation Room for Joe Biden after he was inaugurated. And as we were talking to him about that story, I asked him, were you tempted to write a little note saying at the top of the briefing, you know, good luck? And he said no. I mean, I was tempted, but he said no. We serve in silence.
Yeah.
And that is the ethic of those in the Situation Room. But it was just such an honor to share their stories and to give them a voice. And I hope everyone who reads the book is inspired by them. Thanks,
guys. Appreciate it.
Jonathan, thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, guys. Folks, buy the book.
Jonathan, thank you.
George.
That was great.
Thank you. If you can please stay standing or seated while our guests make their way backstage. Thank you so much to George Stephanopoulos.